October 29th, 1929, a day forever etched into memory as Black Tuesday, the great engine of American prosperity, the stock market, suddenly and violently seized. The initial reaction on Wall Street was one of shock, of disbelief, quickly curdled by hubris. Within hours, a staggering $14 billion simply vanished from the economy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted by 12%. A tidal wave of panic swept the trading floors. Investors, desperate to escape, tried to dump their stocks, only to find there were no buyers. The model they had believed in, the very architecture of their wealth, was revealed to be an illusion. By the middle of November, the market had hemorrhaged nearly $30 billion, a sum greater than the entire annual budget of the United States government. The Dow had lost almost half its value, the nation's most powerful attempt to restore order, to shore up the collapsing edifice. But it was far too late. The damage was absolute. The seeds of this calamity had been sown years before, buried beneath the glittering facade of the Roaring Twenties. It was a decade of jazz, of cultural rebellion, of a seemingly endless boom. But beneath the glamour, the economy was a house of cards. Banks, operating with minimal regulation, loaned money with reckless abandon. The stock market had ceased to be an investment vehicle. It had become a national casino, driven by pure speculation. Millions bought stocks on margin, borrowing up to 90% of the price, gambling on a future that would never arrive. This paper wealth masked a deep and growing sickness. Income inequality had soared to unsustainable heights. The top 1% of Americans held more wealth than the bottom 42% combined. Speculators would hype a stock, buy it up, and then dump it on an unsuspecting public. Factories, in their blind pursuit of growth, produced far more than people could ever afford to buy. In rural America, farmers were already drowning in debt, their own crisis a grim foreshadowing of the one to come. When the market finally broke, the entire fragile system came crashing down with it. By 1933, the economy had hit rock bottom. The plight of homelessness, of poverty, of having no work, became a universal American condition. Unemployment reached an unimaginable 25%. 15 million people were jobless. 9,000 banks failed, their vaults sealed, taking the life savings of generations with them. Homelessness exploded. Families who had lost everything sought refuge in sprawling slums of cardboard and tin, bitterly named Hoovervilles. After the president many blamed for their ruin, they slept in caves in Central Park. Men who had once worked in offices and factories now stood in line for a bowl of soup. Children were pulled from school to help their families survive. The psychological toll was immense. In 1932 alone, over 23,000 Americans took their own lives, the highest number ever recorded at the time. And as if in cruel sympathy with its people, the land itself began to die. A deadly combination of over-farming and a historic drought turned the Great Plains into a barren dust bowl. The Great Crash was more than a financial event. It was a moment of reckoning. It revealed how swiftly an entire world, built on the illusion of permanent prosperity, can be unmade, and how the abstract numbers of a market can translate into the most profound and tangible human suffering. It stands as a stark reminder that the foundations of any society are only as strong as the lives of the people who comprise it. the earth itself, once a promise of prosperity, became the enemy. A continent turned to wasteland. From the plains of Oklahoma and Texas, a great human tide was driven out by dust and despair. They became migrants in their own country, a new kind of pioneer, not of hope, but of desperation. Labeled with the bitter epithet Okies, hundreds of thousands wandered west, chasing the mirage of work in California, a dream that rarely existed. From the White House, a doctrine of rugged individualism echoed across a suffering land. President Hoover held fast to the belief that Americans must solve their own problems, that the government's hand should remain withdrawn. But as the foundations of the economy crumbled, as banks collapsed and breadlines stretched into grim horizons, so too did the public's patience. Anger began to fester. Protest movements, born of desperation, began to spread. In 1932, they reached the nation's capital. Thousands of World War I veterans, the Bonus Army, marched on Washington. They had come to demand what was promised, a bonus for their service, not due until 1945, but needed now to survive. President Hoover, it was said, was not without sympathy for the men, but he saw their demand as fiscally irresponsible. He saw their encampments as an occupation. The order was given. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the United States Army advanced on its own veterans. Bayonets and tear gas met men who had once marched in triumph for their country. It was a spectacle of a nation turning on its own heroes, an event that shocked the American conscience and sealed a president's political fate. When faith in the system shatters, the vacuum is filled. Figures of myth and menace rose from the chaos. Capone, Dillinger, Bonnie, and Clyde. They became outlaws, and in the eyes of some, folk heroes to a public starved for any act of defiance. In the shadows, whispers of radical change grew louder. Some looked to communism, others dreamed of revolution. The election of 1932 was not a choice, but a cry for deliverance. And it was answered. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic governor of New York, won in a landslide, promising a new deal for the American people. On March 4th, 1933, a new voice spoke to the nation, a voice that refused to bow to the prevailing dread. He declared war not on an enemy army, but on despair itself. What followed was a political blitzkrieg, an unprecedented legislative assault on the Great Depression. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt's ambition was threefold: relief, recovery, and reform. First, to staunch the bleeding. The Emergency Banking Act shuttered failing institutions, restoring a fragile trust in the nation's currency. Then, to put a nation back to work. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent an army of young men into the wilderness to plant trees and build parks. The Works Progress Administration created millions of jobs, building roads, schools, and bridges, while also employing artists and teachers, reweaving the nation's cultural fabric. And for the future, a radical new promise. The Social Security Act of 1935 established a safety net of unemployment insurance and pensions. To prevent a future collapse, the Securities and Exchange Commission was created, its purpose to regulate the casinos of Wall Street. Millions found work. Farmers received support. The power of labor grew. It was not a perfect solution. Its critics were many, and its legacy remains debated. But in the darkest hour of the American experiment, it was an assertion that a society need not abandon its people to the whims of fortune. It was a testament to the idea that in the face of ruin, a nation could choose to rebuild not just its infrastructure, but its very soul. Between 1933 and 1936, the nation's debt swelled from $20 billion to nearly $34 billion, a staggering 40% of the entire economy. From the bastions of industry, whispers of socialism turned to roars of condemnation. The highest court in the land dismantled Roosevelt's programs law by law. Even allies within his own party began to waver. Yet he pressed onward, securing an unprecedented 4 terms in office, more than any president before or since. But the promise of a New Deal was not extended to all. For Black Americans, relief was often a trickle, not a flood, as they were systematically excluded from job programs. Women struggled to find a foothold in projects built for men. Across the South, the old hierarchies of race held fussy segregation they were meant to overcome. The nation's industrial heartland became a battleground. In 1937, on a day meant for remembrance, the struggle for workers' rights turned into a massacre. At the Republic Steel plant in Chicago, police opened fire on striking unarmed men. When the smoke cleared, 10 lay dead. It was a brutal testament to the violent fissures running deep beneath the surface of the recovery. Corruption persisted, with waste and political favoritism tarnishing the grand vision of national renewal. For all its imperfections, the New Deal had delivered something essential: hope. By the late 1930s, the fever of the Depression had begun to break, yet a full recovery remained a distant mirage. And then from across the ocean came the tremors of a new and terrible crisis, a global conflict that would reshape everything. While Germany invaded Poland in 1939, America watched from the sidelines. But by 1941, its factories were humming, sending a torrent of supplies to its allies under the Lend-Lease Act. When Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, finally plunged America into the war, the economy did not just shift, it detonated. An industrial titan, dormant for a decade, awoke with breathtaking force. 300,000 aircraft darkened the skies. 102,000 tanks rolled off assembly lines. Nearly 12 million rifles were forged. Over 1,200 major warships were launched to command the seas. The nation's factories, once silent, now roared to life, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Unemployment, the persistent plague of the last decade plummeted to an astonishing 1.2%. Millions of women poured into the workforce, their strength immortalized in the image of Rosie the Riveter. In the crucible of war, a fractured nation found a singular unifying purpose. And in the process, the Great Depression was not merely ended, it was obliterated. The very contract between the American people and their government had been rewritten. From the ashes of despair rose the pillars of a new social safety net. Social security, federal banking regulations, the legal protection of labor. It was a brutal lesson in the consequences of unchecked greed and the deep peril of inequality. Millions had suffered immeasurably, but through the quiet courage of farmers who refused to abandon their land, of workers who fought for their dignity, and of migrants who chased a vanishing horizon, a broken nation was rebuilt. The American dream had been pushed to the brink of extinction, a stark reminder that prosperity is never a guarantee, but a fragile trust, easily shattered and dearly restored.